Hi everyone and welcome back. A watercolour for you this time. If you want a more in-depth look at this painting, there's two full-length videos over on my Patreon channel where I talk a lot more in depth and more in detail about the techniques that I'm using here. Okay, so I'm starting out wet into wet. Just putting a little bit of yellow ochre in there, and I'm using cobalt blue for the sky with a darker mix of Payne's grey, crimson, with a little bit more cobalt blue in there as well. And now for these distant mountains, I'm using exactly the same three colours that I used in the sky, but obviously a lot more concentrated. It's a lot stronger mix. And I use that for the right hand side mountains and the mountains on the left hand side too. I forgot to mention at the start of the video actually, I'll put links to my Patreon channel in the description below, and there'll be one right at the end of the video as well. So now I'm just going over that foreground mountain there with the same colour, but I've just added a little touch of Hooker's green in there. Now I'm using burnt sienna with a little bit of yellow ochre for the rooftops. The paper that I'm working on is Daler Rowney Langton Prestige, £140 cold pressed, so it's got a little bit of texture there. Now for these trees, the dark green mix that I'm using here, I'm applying it fairly flat. I don't really want any texture in it or anything. It's just going to be a very flat wash because I intend to go over it at the end of the painting with some coloured pencils to add some foliage to get some sort of texture on there. Same with the trees on this side as well. Now for this grass bank, I'm using the same green mix, but it's just got more yellow ochre in it, so it's a lighter version. I'm just carefully painting around some of the rock shapes that are there. It's a size 6 brush as well that I'm using, size 6 round. I'm not too sure where this scene actually is. If anybody knows, if anybody recognises it, I'd love to know. If you could let me know in the comments, I'd really appreciate that. Now I'm using the dark green mix that I used for the trees. I'm just putting in some shaded areas along the grass bank. Okay, and at this point I thought that the sky was just looking too light, so I decided to go over it again. I know it's a bit risky, but hey, you know, nothing ventured, nothing gained. So I'm re-wetting the paper, carefully wetting around the buildings there. So I'm just re-wetting the sky area with clean water, and I'm basically using the same colours as before, but just a lot stronger this time. I'm going straight over the mountains there. Kind of help that distant mountain to recede a little bit. Kind of looks, you know, a lot nicer, I think, more sort of misty. I mean, it's going to dry a lot lighter as well, so it looks a little bit grainy at the minute, but it does dry okay. trying to preserve a lighter area in the middle there. It'll be a nice sort of backdrop for the hard edges of the buildings to sort of stand against. So now it's dry, you can see it looks a lot nicer. A lot of that graininess has gone away and it's dried nice and diffused. We've got that nice light area in the middle there, so it was definitely worth taking a risk and putting that second glaze over the sky. Now I'm starting to work on the detail of the buildings. I'm starting to put the texture of the stonework, and I'm using a very small brush. It's a number 2, and the colours that I'm using are a combination of yellow ochre, cobalt blue, with a very small amount of burnt sienna in there, and I'm using it fairly dry on the brush and just grazing the paper, so it's basically a dry brush technique. So I'm letting some of the white of the paper show through, and there's other areas obviously that have got little bits of paint on. It gives a very nice sort of textured effect for stonework. Now I'm just adding a few details to the rocks. I'm using a sort of it's basically the tree mix, I guess. It's sort of the dark green mix there. Just add a few little details there, a little bit of greenery on the rocks. Now it's time just to add a little bit more texture on the shading side of the buildings. I guess I'm fiddling now really, but I can't help it. Never can. I mean, this number 2 brush feels like a pencil, so when that's in my hand I'm sort of in drawing mode with that. I kind of treat it like a pencil really, and I just get carried away with the detail. But now I'm using it again to put the darker areas underneath the roofs there. I'm just using neat Payne's grey for this. Just trying to get a nice thin line. I could have used a pen or could have used a coloured pencil, would have got a lot more accuracy with that, but while the paint's on the palette, just for time's sake I just used it. Trying to keep the lines as thin as possible. I'm using the same mix for the little archways there on the side of the building. They look a bit dark at the minute, but I tone them down later with a little bit of coloured pencil. There'll actually be the reference photo that I copied from to do this painting. It'll actually be on my Patreon page if you're interested. I'll post it up there. Time to use that dark green mix again now, just to put in the rest of the trees. Again, I'm keeping it sort of fairly flat, kind of a flat wash of colour there, because I know the coloured pencils will create a nice textured effect on them. And it seems to work best, on a flatter area of watercolour, instead of a wash that's already got sort of texture on it. It kind of clashes with the watercolour texture if you're using coloured pencils as well. So just a general flat wash, nice and dark, and then some light coloured pencils over that will really look nice. I'm just putting a little bit of shadow now on the side of the buildings. Just using burnt sienna and cobalt blue for that. Okay, now you can see the light's changed, it's a lot lighter. I'm working in natural daylight now. And I'm also using a white coloured pencil. It's a Caran d'Ache Luminance. It's quite an opaque white. It's ideal for this sort of thing. And I'm just using it just to draw in some of the snow on the tops of the mountains. I wasn't quite happy with it at first, but where I left it at this stage, I did actually go back in towards the end of the painting and just alter the shape a little bit more, make it look a lot nicer. Kind of looks like there's a row of dots or something on on the top edge there, which doesn't really look very pleasing to the eye, so I did actually change that later on. I'm still using the white pencil now just to add a few more details, a few more highlights, some of the white window frames, etc. on the buildings. You know, I'm not treating this like a pure watercolour or anything. I'm, you know, considering it to be a mixed media, obviously, because I'm using pencils with it. So I always think coloured pencils work really well, actually, with watercolour. It's a really nice effect. So now I'm using the coloured pencil to put some texture on the trees. And the pencils that I'm using, they're an old set I've got actually of Derwent Studio pencils. And this one is the olive green. It works well with the green mix that's already there. It's just a tone or two actually lighter than the watercolour. So it's a very subtle transition there between the two. And it's just nice just for a little subtle bit of texture. And then I go back in afterwards with another studio pencil. I think that was May Green, which is a lot lighter. Add a few lighter areas as well. I'm also using the coloured pencil there on the grass bank just to add a little bit more texture and interest. Why not? You know, it looks nice. If you're going to use coloured pencil in your painting, you don't just have to restrict it to one area. You can use it here, there and everywhere, you know. I wouldn't overwork it though, just, you know, keep it fairly subtle. Just use it for enhancements, that's all I ever seem to use it for. I don't use it for coloured pencil work per se, you know, shading whole areas or anything like that with it. Just final details, a little bit of texture here and there, and it seems to work really well. So now I'm starting to texture the foreground. All this foreground's going to be covered in grass, sort of a grassy meadow type thing. I'm using a dry brush technique. I'm establishing the darker tones first. It's a method called gris-eye actually. You've seen me do it in pencil and wash where you establish the grey tones first and then you glaze over with colour. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. But obviously I'm not using graphite, I'm using watercolour. So once that area was all filled in with that dry brush technique, I used a very light wash of burnt umber just to suggest whatever it was that was growing in the distance there. I think it was a load of seed heads or a bit of heather, but it certainly had sort of a browny sort of tinge to it. And now I'm using Hooker's green and yellow ochre to brush into that while it's still wet. Another thing you must remember as well, when you're painting over you know, brush textures and things like that, you must let them dry first before you go over them with a glaze. You know, they must be completely bone dry, or you'll end up making a right mess and pulling up the underpainting, and believe me, that won't look good. So make sure it's nice and dry. So that was the first glaze. Now I'm going in with a second glaze. It looks a bit frightening, this one, like I've got it too dark, but I did actually check it first with Maria Kellner's colour previewers, so I know I wasn't going to go wrong. Although it looks, you know, like it's too dark, I know it's going to dry lighter and give me just about the exact effect that I want, which it actually did do. So it's thanks to Maria Kellner's colour previewers. They saved the day again, as they always do. I'll put a link in the description to Maria's website as well for those. So now that last glaze is dry, I'm just going over it with a white coloured pencil just to add a few little wildflowers and sparklers and things like that. And there's a finished drawing. I don't think the coloured pencil looks too bad. I think it worked quite well. So thanks very much for viewing. Hope you like that, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.